Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. And on this episode, I am pumped to have Connor Allen on the show. He is officially the director of betting at Betsperts, but he is just a good bettor, and I'm looking forward to talking to him. Connor, welcome to the show.
Ed, appreciate having me on. Always good chopping it up, talking football. I love the very high level and in-depth breakdowns that you do and the guests that you have on. So exciting to be on.
Well, thank you so much for listening. Have you been mad that they're like 30 minutes now instead of an hour?
Well, it saves me a little time. It means I can get to the next podcast. I kind of like the quick stuff. We used to actually do a longer show ourselves, like with Move the Line with Ryan and I, but we started going shorter and shorter as people's attention spans and how much time they have shortens. I think that's the way to go. So I don't mind the move, actually, to be honest.
I appreciate that. Like, obviously, I would love an hour of your insights, but I also feel like just it's a lot to ask you to kind of prep for an hour, and I feel just a little bit more comfortable with my guests for a half an hour. So, really appreciate you doing this. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. Looking for some action on any given weekend? This is the free service for you, as 5 Nugget Saturday is my curated list of tips in analytics. I bring you tips from sharp people like Connor Allen. To sign up for free, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better sports betting information through data and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Connor, is there an NFL prop bet that you would be willing to share with us?
Yeah, there's one that I really like for this week that I think fits a lot of criteria that I look for, and it's Jalen Polk unders right now. So this number has been moving a lot, opened in 27.5. We're looking at it down to like 19.5, 20.5. And normally I don't like playing things that move this much, but I'm still in on this, and for a couple of reasons. So he's cleared 20 yards once this season, only caught 10 of his 22 targets. But the key factor here is that head coach Gerard Mayo basically said this week, Jalen Polk needs to get over the mental hump. You got to eliminate the dropped passes. You got to be better blocking. He has to continue to grow. He has to work harder. He has to pay more attention to the details. This is what Gerard Mayo said after the game last week. So Jalen Polk responded to that and basically was like, I have the best hands in the league. I don't know what he's talking about. Took zero responsibility, which I'm sure Gerard Mayo loved. The next day in the press conference, Gerard Mayo says, we're going to make some changes to the starting lineup. Things like that. He didn't say directly call out Jalen Polk, but said we need some other guys to move in here. Now, this also coincides with two other factors. We have KJ Osborne didn't play last week. He's going to be healthy and play this week. Kendrick Bourne is working back from an injury, went from 27% to 52% of the snaps. And then Kayshon Boutte played really well. Caught a long bomb from May in the last week. So I think that Jalen Polk's probably going to run like 5 to 10 routes. Like the chance of him being benched here to me seems like extremely, extremely high. So as long as he's active, I think that this under is still a great look at anything above, honestly, like 15 yards, because I'm not even sure he sees a target, but I'm pretty confident that he plays a couple snaps.
Excellent. Does the change in quarterback to Drake May have any effect on your analysis? Obviously, we had Jacoby Brissett, the veteran, before. I've always been high on Brissett, but he wasn't particularly good. May came out, threw some bombs last week. Any opinion on that quarterback change for the New England Patriots?
Yeah, I think overall it's definitely a net positive. I think he flashed more in that one week against a tough Texans defense that has played really well for the most part of the season. And now he played, I would say Drake May played fairly well among the rookie debuts. He had one of the best. And so now he gets a spot against the Jacksonville defense that their run defense didn't look that good last week, but they've been a much better run defense than pass defense. Their pass defense has been really bad. And so Drake May, also, they were able to keep him a little bit more clean last week, which I think was surprising because with Brissett, they were, I think, the league leaders in pressure rate allowed. Now we're going to last week, even against a tougher matchup, they didn't allow that much pressure. So against a Jacksonville defense that also hasn't been able to get a ton of pressure this year, I think that May stays clean. I think that the Patriots are actually pretty live for this game, which sounds like a crazy take if you would have told us this a couple weeks ago, but I'm excited about this offense in general in the passing game. Now, I just don't think Jalen Polk's going to play very much, just as how that ties back to the original prop.
Yeah, I love your analysis there. I think this is a super interesting game. In my predictions, I account for quarterback and I put Drake May's numbers in there. So both how he did on the field last week, which is obviously a small sample size, and then some market data. And actually, the number shifted quite a bit towards New England.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily love it. Jacksonville's been sitting in London for the entire week after getting their butts kicked by Chicago last week,
Yep.
and New England has to go over there, deal with the time change, deal with jet lag, and I was just in Europe, not too long ago in August, and I mean the jet lag just sucks, man. It's just
It's so hard. It's
it's
it's something that I don't know. Maybe I'm just soft. I mean, it impacted me a lot anytime I go to Europe. It's like it ruins days for me.
yeah, no, and it's tough. I feel like yeah. Anyway, so yeah, really interested to see how that goes. Interested to see how Drake May does. Wasn't really high at coming into the season, but he was pretty good last week. So we'll see how it goes. Oh, I also wanted to ask you. You said last week he didn't get a lot of pressure. Pressure tends to be a quarterback stat. So do you are you giving May some of the credit for not getting pressured that much?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned here, pressure is a lot to do with the quarterback stat here. So Drake May not being pressured as much is definitely a lot on him, and his connection with Demario Douglas I thought was fantastic, getting the ball out quicker. I mean, I don't think the Patriots' pass catching options, are very strong overall, but I think that him and Kendrick Bourne are a little bit underrated. So if you can get the ball out quick and have the upside of pushing the ball downfield, like we saw to that deep touchdown, maybe the Patriots in good matchups could play okay offensively.
Connor, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your prop betting process. You obviously talked a lot in your bet about Jalen Polk, about how you listen to what coaches say, but you also do a lot of other analysis. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different angles. And in today's day and age, like the prop market, especially in the NFL, is getting more and more difficult. So the days of just like taking good projections and comparing them to prop lines are kind of over in a sense. That I think it's a good starting point. I just don't know if that's like really enough, especially with like regular props, rushing yards, receiving yards, things like that. But I think that there's a couple of different angles that I like to take that aren't really always necessarily reflected in regular projections for the most part. So I like to look I predominantly play unders for the most part. So we'll start there. And I think that kind of helps fill in some of the gaps. So, like workload, volume concerns, I think are really important. So, like if you're looking at a guy like Javonte Williams tonight, for example, I'm sure some people listen to this pod after, but they already tried to work in Tyler Beatty earlier in the season. Jaleel McLaughlin worked in, and it seems like they don't really want Javonte to be the guy the entire time. So, like, if you were trying to bet his under, like in my opinion, there's a workload concern right off the bat, matchup concern. So you have to factor in matchups on the extremes. Like I don't really care much if a guy is facing the 10th toughest running defense or the 20th worst. Like it's in my opinion, it's kind of like those fringe outliers that matter a lot for success, especially on a matchup and efficiency basis. And then there's also game script, which I think can give you outs or elevate you. So if your team is a big underdog, potentially you're going to see more passing work. I would, you could potentially shy away from taking any passing under, and then vice versa. There, like if you're a big favorite, you have an extra out of maybe getting a whole extra quarter of just basically carries and run plays there as well. So I think individually, largely none of those matter unless they're at the extremes, like we talked about with Jalen Polk and the coach speak, and kind of his usage there, which is already trending down. Like that already had two of the factors that I just mentioned. Ideally, it has all like 3 to 4 different factors that are working against a player or for a player if I'm betting the over. So I think that there's again just like different angles that aren't necessarily always factored in projections because they're just they're really volatile situations that like again, if we're right on Polk, like his projection and if he's going to play 5 to 10 snaps, like it should probably be in the single digits. If I'm wrong, then I think the projection is probably about right in this matchup. So it's one of those things that it's really difficult to project on like just a median basis.
You also like to look at defensive scheme
Yep.
as well. Who plays two high safeties, how they do. Where are you getting that data, and how does that kind of work itself into your analysis?
Yeah, so I really like the amount of data that's available. We might have talked about this on the last time we met, but the amount of data that's available now is just fantastic because you have data versus man versus zone versus, cover two, versus cover three, single high versus middle field open. So like last week we played AJ Brown's over of 68 and we played alt over of 100. A lot of that had to do with his success against man coverage, his success against cover one and cover three, which the Browns play a lot of. And so it's one of those factors where we're able to easily do this now because Fantasy Points Data has a great data suite. NFL Pro has launched like their new subscription, which has some unique data, especially in the running game and defensive side of the ball with like where they're running and like top speeds and being able to filter for data, but then click on those exact instances and watch the film, which I thought was really interesting as well. Like I think it was one of the teams that I was looking at last week. Maybe it was the Ravens or a couple weeks ago. They had only allowed like a couple. Their stats themselves were not that good. It was like they had allowed a certain amount of rushing yards, but if you actually looked at the big runs, it was all from like quarterbacks. So like it wasn't really applicable to fading a running back in that spot. It was just like Lamar Jackson scramble that they had played before prior. So I think having access to this data in the new day and age is like incredible. So NFL Pro, definitely want to give a shout out to Fantasy Points as well. They do an awesome job there. And then PFF has some good data too. Like I think there's just so much good data that's like easier and easier to now be accessible and then also implement into your analysis is important. Now, I will say on the other side, like word to caution, like if you're using things that are like happening 10% of the time or 15% of the time, you need to think about like how often is this really going to happen in a game where there's only, an offense is only going to be running whatever 60 to 70 snaps, somewhere in that range, right? So like how often is a team going to play against like, zone or man blitzes in this team if they're only running it like 20%, you know what I mean? So you're talking about 10 plays all game, which can lead to more variance. So I think contextualizing some of that stats is important too, because I've seen it misused now with the growth of like how easy it is. I think it's misused at times as well.
So you just try to stay away from the extremes? Is that kind of your
I
words
would
of
say
wisdom?
it's more of like just like understanding the amount that it's like applicable. So like the Jaguars the first few weeks were playing like a crazy high amount of man coverage and it was like over 50%. So like if I can reliably be like, okay, well, at least half the time they're probably going to do this, I can feel pretty good about it. I would say I would just worry about like, oh, this team's only playing this specific coverage and this specific scheme like 15% of the time, and this receiver is really good against this. Like, again, you're only getting 15% of a game, so like that's the stuff that I think is almost overemphasized in a sense.
Excellent. So the Jets and the Bills got some shiny new toys at wide receiver this week. Would love to hear your breakdown of this. First, let's start with the Jets. Aaron Rodgers is in his first, I guess, full season because he got hurt last year, and then now he gets his boy Davante Adams, whose stats have kind of gone downhill over the last couple of years since he's been in Las Vegas. Do you think this can make a difference for this Jets team?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for all the talk that Alan Lazard got about like being Aaron Rodgers' best friend and everything, like, yeah, he had a nice touchdown catch on the Hail Mary, and then there was the one that went through the guy's like, armpit
Yeah, that was
basically.
crazy.
That was wild. I mean, besides that, like Lazard dropped a bunch. They were not on the same page plenty of times. Like, I don't know. I thought that whole thing was a little bit just like overrated as a talking point in general. But I do think that Davante Adams coming back is really important, especially in the short to intermediate areas, because in those areas, like Garrett Wilson, I think did a pretty good job, especially in chain moving situations, but it wasn't on the same level that we saw from like vintage Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers. And even if Davante Adams is worse, I think that he's going to help a ton in that area. And beyond that too, like having someone else that can draw coverage away from Garrett Wilson is so impactful to this offense, because Garrett Wilson's a very explosive player, but if he's being bracketed and like, basically watched very intensely, he's just obviously not going to be as effective. And so I think this opens up a ton for their offense long term. Now, this week specifically, I think there was a little bit overreaction in the market. I think we saw like a 2+ point move on the total as soon as Davante Adams was traded. Like, I think he'll probably play a good amount, maybe 50-60% of the snaps at best. But again, it's probably more of a red zone option, more of like a short yardage option. So I thought that could have been a little bit of an overreaction on the total.
But in general, you like Adams going there, even though
Definitely.
he's probably not the same player that he was, when they
I
last
mean,
played in Green Bay.
Mike Williams is like a dust. I don't know if he's still recovering from his injury, but like he couldn't separate. He couldn't do anything. all of his unders. I mean, we played his unders like 3 weeks in a row, I think. And those were just, I mean, he just like isn't as good of a player anymore. And Rodgers, I think Rodgers and him didn't have a connection. Obviously, Rodgers like completely threw him under the bus with the whole interception. I don't know how much it was his fault necessarily, to be honest, but even prior to that play, he was not playing well.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely the drop on Monday night didn't help either. Let's move on to the Bills. They lost Stephon Diggs in the offseason, and now they get Amari Cooper from Cleveland. How do you think this impacts the Bills' offense?
Yeah, I think this is also, I mean, really significant because the Bills have been, I would say, shuffling through a lot of receivers to try and find guys to separate. And we saw this actually early in Josh Allen's career. Like, he didn't really have any good receivers. No one was really separating, getting open. As soon as he gets Stephon Diggs, and obviously there were other factors as well, like he was significantly better. And we haven't obviously seen him regress to like his rookie year point at this point this season, but like he needs someone who can consistently get open, especially in the short to intermediate areas. And Khalil Shakir can kind of do that. Dalton Kincaid, I thought was going to do that more this year. He has not necessarily done that. So having a guy like Amari Cooper who's still a really good route runner, I think is going to be really big for them. Again, especially in like chain moving opportunities here, allows Keon Coleman too to kind of be more of like a, deep threat jump ball kind of guy. Like I think that's just basically what Keon Coleman is, to be honest. So like I think it's a big point for their offense. I think they're going to bring him along slowly, though. I'm really interested to see what his prop number comes out at this week. There's been multiple points of coach speak talking about how they're going to bring him along slowly, make sure he understands the playbook. Like he's going to be active. He's probably going to play some snaps. I don't know how much they use him, though, at least right off the bat. I think he's got a lot to learn there on the playbook side. So long term, though, again, I'd say similar. Like long term, I'm extremely bullish on this addition here for the Bills.
I think it has to be. I'm looking at some of my passing success rate numbers adjusted for opponent, and Buffalo's really near NFL average right now, which is, not where they want to be if they want to contend for a Super Bowl. At the beginning of this season, I kind of thought that they would be fine without Diggs, partially because his numbers haven't really been terrific. I guess they also lost Gabe Davis as well. The idea is Shakir is going to get more targets. Dalton Kincaid is going to be better. But, Kincaid's results really haven't been there, as you mentioned. Do you feel like Kincaid gets fewer targets now, or how do you think it's going to get spread around?
Yeah, it's really tough because we've seen with Joe Brady, like, unless the matchup dictates like a massive pass funnel, which we saw against like the Jaguars, they tried to do it a little bit against the Ravens. Like, Joe Brady wants to run the ball. Like, his pass rate over expectation is really low. That's just like the baseline of what they want to do. But if they think that that's not going to work, they're not afraid to go pass heavy. And I think that it impacts Kincaid in a lot of different ways because in the games where they're going run heavy again, like last week, like Kincaid went, I think, 6 for 57, which is fine. Like that's a good floor. But this is going to lower that floor a little bit in these games where they're run heavy. Like his floor is going to be, again, probably 2-3 targets, something like that in those games. Now in the pass heavy games or the games where it's like back and forth, a little bit of a shootout, I think Amari Cooper actually could help him in a sense that like he's just going to be more open. He's going to have less eyes on him, less coverage on him. And I think kind of like Davante Adams helps Garrett Wilson in a sense. I think Amari Cooper just kind of boosts the offense in general because the amount of drives that have like just stalled because no one can get open basically has been really bad. So again, I think, long term, easy to be bullish on this Amari addition for the Bills offense.
Yeah, and it definitely depends on the game script, as you mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about Cleveland. They are bad. Deshaun Watson is bad. He has not been benched, and now he loses his best receiver. So how do you see this playing out for the rest of the season?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a little bit more even today because they've started to go a little run heavier. And so now we have Nick Chubb returning too, and their splits after they lost Nick Chubb. So they started last season before Nick Chubb got injured. Like they were pretty run heavy as well. He got injured, and then even with Watson for like 2 games, they started going pass heavier. And then obviously we know like Flacco took over, was chucking the ball like 40, 50 times a game, crushing. And that was awesome. I mean, in my mind, that's just a testament to that like a competent quarterback can execute this offense in a pass heavy scheme. But that's just not what Deshaun Watson is right now. So I think that they're going to revert as Nick Chubb, comes along here. They're going to revert back to a much, much, much more run heavy scheme. And It could be okay for this team. I mean, their defense hasn't looked at anywhere near as dominant as they were in previous seasons either. So maybe it won't matter. But I'm really interested to see how it goes because Watson now without Cooper, I think he's probably going to feed Njoku a lot. I think Judy maybe a little more. I mean, he's been the primary target of plenty of teams before, and that hasn't necessarily panned out. And the quarterback play is still pretty brutal. So I think it's mostly just going to be more Njoku and a lot of Nick Chubb down the stretch.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. You actually made a pretty interesting comment that it looked like the Browns were gonna bench Watson at halftime, and Jameis Winston was warming up, and then he wasn't benched.
That I see. I don't know. Like I feel like I'm putting my tinfoil hat here with this whole theory, but I mean, I was watching the game. Like they flashed the screen over to Jameis Winston, helmet on, throwing the ball at halftime. Deshaun Watson sitting on the bench without a helmet. Like, I mean, it was very strange. It seemed like something that maybe the owner made a call or something like that. I am pretty confident at this point, based on not only that, but then like the conversations after with O'Connell basically saying, or Stefanski's basically saying, like, oh, like, it's not my decision. Like, or he didn't say that specifically, but it was like, oh, we make decisions collaboratively. Like, like he's basically saying it's not his decision. So I think that they're just all in on the sunk cost fallacy here of Deshaun Watson because they paid him so much money because they don't have an easy out. They're just in a really, really bad position. And at this point, I almost think that playing him probably gets them a better draft pick to get a new quarterback and just figure it out from there because he's been so bad. Like it's really hard to overstate like how bad he's been.
It's really sad. There was a
It is.
time in which I thought he was one of the two best quarterbacks in the NFL, and it was just a complete joy to watch the man throw a football. And he's
Yep.
just nowhere. He's just nowhere near that, and it's. I mean, it's a bummer for football, right? You want to see stars play well because it's good for the game, and yeah, it's just sad. So
It is really sad because I mean, yeah, you think back to the Houston Texans days. He's rolling out. He's throwing deep balls to Will Fuller, to DeAndre Hopkins. There's a fun chart that I like to look at on. It's like what is it? Runningbacksdon'tmatter.com, like RB's DM. There's like a completion percentage above expectation, and then EPA per play on the other axis. Like Deshaun Watson is just like bottom left, like literally
yeah,
like as bad as you can get on EPA per play, and then completion percentage above expected is like -4%, which is actually in line with Jordan Love. I think he's actually 31st out of 32 behind. The only person worse than him in CPOE is Jordan Love, which is a little bit interesting on another topic there. But yeah, Deshaun is just, I mean, again, like stone cold bottom left, which is not surprising.
Connor, you've been looking at some SGP, same game parlays, and some negative correlation to find some value in bets. Can you explain how you're doing this?
Yeah, I don't remember who it was that showed me this a couple of years ago, but so I started reading this book as well this offseason, and I think that explains it pretty well. It's called Interception. It's like the second part of Logic Sports Betting essentially, and one of the sections talks about basically like pricing models and how one thing being off with those pricing models can essentially impact all of the alts, can impact basically everything, and that certain things are just basically impossible to account for. So FanDuel's pricing model specifically, we'll talk about FanDuel because I think they do, I mean, the worst job at it in this sense. So they overprice for correlation, like regular correlation. So we'll talk about Jameson Williams. So if I want to bet Jameson Williams over 3.5 receptions and over his regular prop of 46 yards, both of those, we'll say they're both -110 just for math's sake. A normal parlay on those without any correlation, a normal parlay of two -110s ends up being like, I think it's like plus 260 to plus 280, depending on where you get it, right? So in this instance, FanDuel will give you like plus 150 on those two if you parlayed the same game prop, which, I mean, again, it's the same player. It's the same player. So it makes sense. There has to be some layer of correlation baked in. But now when you do the opposite, which is the negative correlated parlay, you do under receptions and over yards or under yards and over receptions. It brings the odds from like up to like 10-1 or 20-1. So literally last week, I played Jameson Williams under 3.5 receptions and 70 plus yards because it's like very difficult for these pricing models to capture average depth of target, to capture like total passing volume and like matchups and stuff like that. So all of that is like really difficult because Jameson Williams only saw, I think, 3 targets the whole game, 3, 4 targets. I had like based on my analysis, I thought, okay, well, this team is going to go really run heavy, which is going to lead to way fewer opportunities for Jameson Williams. And so, again, in this kind of game script, if this goes, I'm expecting like Jameson's probably only going to see 3, 4, 5 targets, and 1 to 2 of those, he's one of the most explosive players in the league. He could easily break for a long gain. So again, it put us in a situation where under 3.5 receptions and I think 70 yards was like 40 to 1 or 50 to 1 or something like that. So I like especially to take shots on that with certain players each week that profile in different like average depth of target ranges. So like in previous years, it was guys like Gabe Davis who are only going to see like 3, 4 targets a game, and their reception line is a reflection of that. But their yardage prop, like if they're catching 3 balls, it's going to be way deeper than their regular median prop is assigned with. So it's kind of one of those things that like reverse engineering kind of like the pricing model and seeing if there's any like I don't know potential outcomes that are not necessarily factored in. And I think that this is one of them. It's becoming more popular. I'm sure that FanDuel is going to change it at some point and maybe nuke it a little bit. Like Caesars doesn't let you do it at all. Like it's actually makes the odds worse somehow. If you do the negatively correlated stuff, which is hilarious. DraftKings has it a little bit. So I'm just riding it for as long as it goes. And there's certain players that I key in on every week that I think are kind of fun and provide unique opportunities. Again, they're still long shots for a reason. I just think that they should be probably half of what the odds are giving us, to be honest, at this point.
Absolutely. I would think the negative correlation on a player like Kansas City Xavier Worthy would also be worth a look as well. He's a rookie. He's super fast. He doesn't get a ton of targets, and but he's explosive. And he might get a lot more targets now. I think he might get more targets as he continues to get worked into the offense. No Rashee Rice there. He's literally right. I mean, behind Juju Smith-Schuster, probably the second target. So we'll see how that goes.
We actually bet him 2 weeks ago when he had 3 for 73 and a touchdown against the Chargers because they keep setting his reception line at 3.5 because, like what you mentioned, like, oh, well, there's, who else they're going to throw the ball to, right? That was kind of
exactly.
And so I actually didn't bet it last week for that reason because I'm like, are they really going to feature Juju Smith-Schuster here? And they did, lo and behold, they did. But the week prior, I had the under 3.5 and like 50 plus, 60 plus. And so that cash, which is awesome. I think I might go back to it this week. I mean, like, I think he's just not a target earner at this point in his career. So like if they get him the ball, it might be on jet sweeps. It might be like screens. But he's just so explosive that like one play over the top is all it takes. And I mean, him catching 4 to 5 balls would take a lot of push from Andy Reid and the Chiefs to like get him the ball that much.
Absolutely. Is there can you give us another player that you're kind of looking at for these negative correlation type bets?
Yeah, so this week specifically, I think that Washington pass catchers are really interesting because they've been really good at running the ball, and they have an awesome matchup here against the Panthers. But when they do pass the ball, like these guys have massive upside. So like a guy like Terry McLaurin, his reception line is probably going to be around 4.5, 5.5. So taking the under on receptions and over on yards, like I mean, I just don't think that there's going to be a ton of passing volume in this game. But the matchup is pristine. It's almost like kind of like the Jameson Williams play in a sense. And so I think that's a really, really interesting one for this week specifically. And then you can play the reverse of this stuff though. So like Jackson Smith and Jigba, I've bet like receptions overs and yards under because his average up the target is like 7.5 to 8. And in certain matchups, I mean, he's just like, again, like running short little routes. They use him in like short instances, like, little out routes on like 3rd down and 2, 3rd down and 3. And they pass the ball a ton, one of the highest pass rate over expectations in the league. Now, again, if you're passing the ball a lot, he's catching a lot of balls. Like he had 8 receptions for 51 yards. I had an under or 5 plus receptions and under 51.5 yards. So I lost by a half a yard, but that was tough, but it's one of those things where like, again, like if you didn't catch that last ball, like you're pretty close. And the theory was right, just missed about like half yard. So.
Right. Do you feel like FanDuel prices like, do they consider air yards to a receiver at all? Or do you feel like it's just a general correlation between receptions and yards that they're using?
Yeah, I would say it's just a general correlation between receptions and yards from my understanding. Like I think it would be extremely difficult. I'm not in charge of a sports book, so I think it would be extremely difficult to fully understand and properly price each player on an individual basis because their usage is just like so different from player to player, especially on the extremes, like the ones that we mentioned, already. So like pricing that properly, I think is really difficult, but I think that their solution is probably just going to be to like nuke the entire thing. So like they're like you just across the board, they're going to shave off like a certain number of I don't know, I guess basically points or whatever you want, juice across the board on any negative correlation because I mean, that's just a lot easier again than to price out like Gabe Davis versus Amon-Ra St. Brown versus Justin Jefferson's like average depth of target and pass rate and like what volume they're going to see. Cause like all of that's factored into negative correlation. Whereas like a regular prop is just, I mean, it includes some of that obviously, but it's different for the payouts that you get negative correlated props.
Connor, can you give us a surprising prediction for the rest of the NFL season?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Philadelphia Eagles finish with the best record in the NFC the rest of the year. This team, they got Lane Johnson back, they got AJ Brown back. They haven't looked fully up to snuff, but the schedule is just so easy the rest of the season. It's one of those things where I think honestly the Jets are in a similar boat here where things are trending the right direction and their schedule is just laying up for them like it should be much easier. So I like this Eagles team to just take care of business, win the division, and then potentially finish with one of the best records in the NFC entirely. I don't know how good they are necessarily on a team basis, but again, when the schedule lines up like that, I think they're in a really good spot.
I like it a lot. I actually like Eagles -3, I think is the current line against the New York Giants because the Giants are probably overperforming and then also have a lot of key injuries as well. And I think the Eagles, like some of their underlying stats have been better than some of the score line. I actually don't think they're particularly good. But like the game against Cleveland, right? Like they really did outperform Cleveland and probably should have won by a lot more than 4 points, right? It probably shouldn't have been a game.
They played with their food a little too long there. Awesome. That was tough. That's down to 3. I think it was like up to 4.5 at one point. Which is not like necessarily a big move as like through too many key numbers, but I don't know. That's interesting for sure.
Connor Allen, thank you so much for joining me on the Football Analytics Show. Please let everyone know where they can get all your good work.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at Connor Allen NFL. And then all of my props are posted at 44.com in our Discord, and I'll have articles and everything each week.
Awesome. And the Discord is a pay service over there on 444, right?
It is. Yep. Yeah. It's a paid service. And if you guys are interested in it, I can give you, we have a bunch of ways to get it for super cheap. So feel free to slide in the DMs, shoot me a message. If you liked anything I'm talking about, I probably give you a couple props for free as well. If you want to see kind of the analysis that we put into each one. So we have defensive props from Noonan. We have my offensive props, which are mostly unders to be honest. And some alts. We dabble in the pick'em sites, everything, and a couple other cappers as well. So appreciate you having me on, Ed.
Thank you so much, Connor. You've been listening to the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting newsletter. Every weekend, I serve up 5 Nugget Saturday, which is my curated list of tips and analytics. I bring insights from sharp people like Connor Allen. Check that out at thepowerrank.com. The 60-minute guide to the 2024 football season is my audiobook that contains 2 deep dive stories that apply analytics to football betting. If you dig in, you can see how my prediction on Tennessee quarterback Will Levis is doing. You may be able to listen on Spotify for no additional charge. If you're listening to this podcast on Spotify, click on the podcast icon in the top left corner. It's yellow and black. And then click on More Like This. The 60-minute guide to the 2024 football season will appear under host recommendations. Once again, my name is Ed Fang. Thanks so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next week.